Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a debate that's both controversial and thought-provoking regarding early Christian martyrdom and persecution.
Yeah, and it really shakes up the traditional narrative we grew up with, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So the crux is, were early Christians really persecuted in a systematic, brutal way by the Roman Empire, or did the church, embellish the story to build its authority?
Right, it's a fascinating, almost unsettling angle, I must say.
Exactly, and one scholar really pushing back on the traditional view is Dr. Candida Moss. She's argued that the widely accepted narrative of relentless Roman persecution is largely a myth. She suggests that the persecution was not as systematic as we think.
Interesting, so she's saying it's more of a constructed narrative than a precise historical account?
Precisely. According to her, while there were certainly Christians who died, like Polycarp of Smyrna, whose account is well documented, the majority of the martyr stories were either embellished or, dare I say, or even entirely fictional. They were created for nearly propagandist purposes.
That makes you wonder how much of what we consider historical is in fact just myth-making.
Absolutely, and what's striking is that Moss categorizes these martyr narratives into three distinct types: actual historical accounts, semi-legendary stories, and those that read more like ancient fan fiction, complete with dramatic, unbelievable feats.
Right, so there's the solid stuff, then stuff that's partly true but narrative styled, and then the ones that are completely over the top.
Yeah, it's like the narrative around Perpetua and Felicitas falls into that semi-legendary category. Their stories have a historical base, but they're also shrouded in layers of literary and theological embellishment, which, gives them this almost mythic quality. It's that blending of fact and fiction. It's that...
Yeah. And then there are the accounts that are utterly fictional, right? Like those tales found in texts such as the Acts of Paul and Thecla.
Exactly. Those accounts, with elements like saints fighting dragons or surviving incredible fires, definitely seem more like creative storytelling rather than rigorous historical record.
It's almost akin to epic legends, designed to inspire rather than to document.
Right, and what's even more intriguing is that many of these stories weren't recorded until decades or even centuries after the supposed events, which really puts their reliability into question. It's like trying to remember a dream.
True. And that brings us to the supporting scholars who also offer a re-examination of this narrative.
Exactly. For instance, Brent Shaw questioned the notion that Nero's persecution was a targeted campaign against Christians. He argued that Tacitus's account might actually reflect Christian self-fashioning rather than an objective Roman policy.
That's an interesting twist. Tacitus's work, while valuable, might also be colored by the propaganda of its time, right?
Absolutely. And then you've got scholars like G.W. Bowersock, who suggest that these martyrdom accounts were part of a broader Greco-Roman literary genre. Writers back then often crafted stories to evoke awe and devotion rather than to serve as precise history.
Yeah.
It's almost as if these narratives were meant to inspire faith.
And Elaine Pagels builds on that, arguing that suffering narratives helped define the boundaries of the community, propelling a unique identity through shared adversity.
Exactly. And Bart Ehrman, though generally more cautious, points out that pseudepigraphy was common during this period. So many of these accounts might have been deliberately attributed to well-known figures with the purpose of promoting a particular theological agenda.
Right. It's a bit of a double-edged sword then. Narrative power versus historical accuracy.
Yeah, it is. And now, speaking of defending the traditional view, there's a whole contingent of scholars and apologists like Michael Licona and Paul L. Meyer. They maintain that there's substantial evidence from pagan sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, and even Pliny the Younger, that early Christians were marked as suspicious and subversive. They argue these accounts, especially the letters like Pliny's to Emperor Trajan, demonstrate that execution for nonconformity was indeed a reality.
So essentially, while early Christians did face execution for refusing to conform, they weren't necessarily the victims of a massive state-sponsored persecution machine, right?
Exactly. The difference being that many of these executions were more about civil disobedience, refusing to offer incense to the emperor, for instance, rather than being relentlessly hunted for the sake of their faith.
It's that subtle but important distinction.
Right. And here's where the paradox really emerges. After Christianity gained power, especially post-Constantine, the church didn't discard this martyr narrative. Instead, they amplified it.
Yeah.
Martyrdom became a sort of moral badge, giving an aura of sanctity and victimhood.
It's like the church was essentially redefining victimhood for theological power.
Exactly. This narrative of suffering and unjust persecution helped to cement a sense of divine favor and moral authority. It was a clever use of history, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that styled the church as the Church of the Martyrs.
Now that raises some uncomfortable questions, doesn't it? I mean, isn't it a bit manipulative to, build an identity on the idea of being persecuted even when the actual events might not fully support it?
Exactly, and I think that's where a respectful critique comes into play. While I see the logical appeal of using martyrdom narratives, one could argue that exaggerating these accounts for the sake of moral legitimacy might distort historical records, making it challenging for us to truly understand the past. It's a classic case of history being reshaped by those in power.
Right. And what's more interesting is how this narrative evolved over time. In the post-Roman world, persecution didn't just stop. It turned inward. Under medieval Christendom, the persecutors became the persecuted in many cases, and vice versa.
Totally. The same institutions that once championed the martyrs ended up firing the first shots during the Inquisition and the Crusades. Yeah. It's almost like history coming full circle with a twist of irony.
And then during the Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants claimed the mantle of persecution, each side asserting that they were the true victims.
Right? Which further muddied the waters, because historical accounts could be retold or even reinterpreted, depending on who was in power.
It really shows how powerful narratives can be, not just in shaping our view of the past, but also in legitimizing present power structures.
Exactly. And to bring it full circle, Moss urges us to ask critical questions. Why were these martyr stories written? When were they written? And for what purpose? It's not a call to deny martyrdom altogether, but to recognize that many of these narratives might be more reflective of theological and political agendas than of a straightforward historical record. And that's a perspective that forces us to rethink even our most sacred histories.
Absolutely. It highlights just how complex the interplay of faith, history, and power really is.
And it leaves us with a provocative takeaway. While the martyrdom of early Christians is real in part, it's also deeply entangled with a narrative crafted to confer lasting moral and spiritual authority on the church.
So, in the end, we're left to ponder whether these powerful stories are historical truths or dynamic symbols meant to inspire and legitimize a movement.
Exactly. And that open question is what keeps the debate alive. It's a reminder that history, much like faith, is a living dialogue between fact and interpretation.
And that's what makes exploring it so endlessly fascinating, right?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for engaging in this deep dive with me. It's been quite the journey through time, tradition, and transformation.
Absolutely. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.